With local government, because affirmatively furthering fair housing we're going to talk a lot about. And how many folks are property managers, people who issue mortgages, actually are out there with the clients who may be feeling that they are discriminated against? A fair amount of people, as I suspected, a fairly large part of the audience. Just so you know, actually I've spent more of my life on that side of the table than on the HUD side. I started as a lawyer. I did complex commercial real estate, but in my day I've defended an FH&EO complaint when I represented the Pike Place market. I was chair of the Seattle Housing Authority when we spent a long time negotiating how we could do building-specific wait lists without running into the problems of steering, racial steering that happened in the South when they allowed building-specific wait lists. But we wanted to let people to say, my community, my church perhaps is near this building. I want to be on that wait list and not have to go up to North Seattle, for example. How you did that without discriminating or unconsciously discriminating. And then I spent most of the last decade running the homeless systems in Seattle, King County. And as you've heard a little bit about, a number of folks who are homeless are there because of what is really discrimination. People who can't get housing because of a 20-year-old nonviolent conviction that has nothing to do with whether or not they really are going to be a good tenant, but does, because of the disproportionality with which we enforce our laws, have a lot to do with their race. So I've been on the other side of that table for a long time, but I've also seen, even as I was on that side of the table, why it is so important that we have the laws that inform us, that educate us, and that sometimes are enforced against us to make sure that everybody in the community truly has a fair opportunity for housing in our country. This year we commemorate the 47th year since the passage of the Fair Housing Act. We recently celebrated 50 years since the March on Washington. We've been remembering Selma and what people fought for and some people died for in that process. And President Obama recently said the march is not finished, but we're getting closer. He also said we just need to open our eyes and ears and hearts to know that this nation's racial history still casts its long shadow upon us. We know that the march is not yet over, the race is not yet won, and that reaching that blessed destination where we are all judged by the content of our character requires admitting as much. We've made a lot of progress. People who weren't around 50 years ago may be surprised to realize that absolute overt racism was accepted in this country. People were unabashedly and openly racist. We have moved away from that. We have done better in terms of understanding that discrimination against women, against people with disabilities, is not right, although I think we've not reached the point that we have around race. I think we've not done as well in understanding that discrimination based on national origin, or based on sexual orientation, or based on familial status isn't right. That denying people opportunities that have nothing to do with how they will really perform, what they will do as your tenant, is not right. But even as we, on an intellectual and conversational level, have made a lot of progress, there's still a lot that we realize we face on the implicit and unspoken, and some often unacknowledged basis. I think we've all been shocked by the video of seeing black men shop, when if you look inside yourself, you know if that person had been white, that trigger would not have been pulled. Now, if I pulled that patrolman aside and said, asked him questions about was he racist, did he disapprove of racism, I'm sure he'd say he wasn't racist. I'm sure he'd say he disapproved of racism. But our implicit reactions, our unconscious reactions, just because of the society we are in, often have consequences. And that brings me to something I've done for myself just because I was curious. How many people know of the Harvard Implicit Associations Test? You ever heard of it? Oh, good, I'll call on you next. They set out to say what really happens with our unconscious assumptions. And Google it, try it, take it, it's free. It starts out, you start matching the word good and the word bad to words. War, flowers, smiles, damage, good and bad. You start matching faces, black and white, and it's how quickly you do that. And then, and I won't go through the whole process and how they make sure that it's not that your left hand's quicker than your right, but you start to have to match a word like war or like flowers to a pair. And the pair is, for example, white face and the word bad. How quickly do you get war over onto that side? How quickly do you get flowers over to a black face and good? And the same with the reverse. It's a white face and good and a black face and the word bad. And the idea is that when there's congruity, the face is the same association as good, your matching will be quicker. It's quicker to say that war goes with a black face and bad, if that's unconsciously what you're thinking, than it is to get war over to a white face and the word bad. Interesting concept. I've taken it. I'm not surprised, but I'm certainly not pleased. I am mediocre on that. My unconscious mind more quickly associates good things with white and good than it does with black and good. It's just the way I am because of the society I've grown up in. And what that reminds us is that believing the right thing, intellectually stating the right thing, being committed to the right thing, doesn't mean that we don't have a set of reactions that we have to deal with in yet another way to make sure that we are not categorizing people not by who they are, but by what our assumptions are. And one of the ways you see that is in testing. Testing is when Intermountain goes out and submits two people with the same resume, but one of which may be named LaShawna and the other of which is named Tom. And the question is, who gets the call back on the apartment? And I would say that probably if you went to those apartment managers and said, did you do this on the basis of race? They'd say, absolutely not. I'm completely opposed to that. But maybe your association, you pick out that name that you associate with somebody who's African American, and you spot more quickly the bad thing in their resume. You pick up on it quicker because it's quicker to associate bad with your assumptions than it is good. And you do it the opposite way, perhaps for a different race. So that's the sort of thing that we need to work on, not by shaking a finger at somebody, but by education, by what we're doing today, by saying, what systems do I put in place? What cautions do I give myself? What ways do I use to deal with simply the society I live in to make sure that I really do give a full opportunity to everybody based on who they are, not what attributes they happen to have. So FHNEO spends a lot of time on education. I think that's terribly important. I'm really pleased with what's going on here, with creating those structures, those warning flags that allow you to say, wait a minute, am I really doing that completely impartially? And enforcement when it's necessary. There's also a piece, and you'll hear about it later today, called Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing. Again, it's often implicit, but if I'm Westchester County, New York, and I like having everybody to have 2-acre lots, do I ever consider the fact that nobody poor in my community is really going to be able to live in Westchester, and that mostly, given the community I'm dealing with, that's people of color? Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing says, what do you need to do in your planning to make sure that there are opportunities in your community for everybody? What do you need to make available in terms of transportation? What do you need to do in terms of zoning so that multifamily is built? What do you need to do to make sure that people who need supportive housing, for example, because of a disability, are not excluded from your community? So I'll talk a bit about Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, and that's going to be a lot for your government folks here today, because that really needs to be a joint work between HUD and governments. Now, I'm pleased that Intermountain Fair Housing Council is working here in Idaho. It's a FIP, not a FAP. It took me a long time to figure out the difference between those two. But not a direct enforcer, but education, screening complaints. And I want to touch on education. This year, Intermountain Fair Housing Council has done events in Moscow where there were 47 folks, Lewiston 57, Boise 366 registered and 276 online. Oh, no, excuse me, 276 on site, the rest online. By the way, you people online, I could see your raised hands on what you do. You just didn't know it. Another Boise event, 214, Idaho Falls. This sort of education is what I think we all want to make sure that we achieve what we want to achieve, but you manage to do it in a way that allows you to do your job. The Fair Housing Council has also screened 718 inquiries from the public and processed 185 of those for potential fair housing issues, and it's important, then went to mediation on 70 of those to say, how can we resolve this without having to get into court? And those mediations resulted in everything from unit retention to extra time to move to return of deposits, changes in the occupancy policy. More than 50 of those mediations involved folks with disabilities. And nationally, what HUD handles in terms of FH&O complaints is 53% involving people with disabilities. And I think that's in part because we don't have the sensitivity about our unconscious discriminations against people with disabilities that we have gradually been building with regard to our unconscious discrimination against other folks. And those mediations involved everything from carpet replacement to allowing a support animal, allowing somebody to move to the ground floor, providing simple things like grab bars. Testing. The Intermountain Fair Housing Council has done more than 100 instances of testing and has worked where they've found discrimination to figure out how to solve it, how to do a conciliation, or when necessary has filed complaints. And then education of consumers. Conducting a number of events for people with limited English proficiency. That's becoming a major area of discrimination, and it becomes essentially a surrogate for national origin. They developed videos in English and Spanish, conducted Spanish language radio programs, and done 21 fair housing events with church groups and other nonprofits. So, going quickly through the sorts of things you're going to learn about today and tomorrow, and I should note with respect to enforcement, because it is ultimately what everybody I think is a little worried about, HUD has become much more involved in enforcement. We had $425 million in enforcement penalties this last year. In terms of claims of systemic discrimination, for example, a bank that says we will not consider the income of somebody that's pregnant because we're going to assume they're not going to work after they're pregnant. Clear discrimination, systemic. We've moved from 234 in 2013 to 325 complaints in 2014. So you're going to hear about issues around mortgages, how people's income qualifies. Predatory lending, I hope, will be covered. One point on mortgages is that in the housing burst of 2008, the folks who lost the most net worth were the communities of color, and they find themselves facing huge barriers now in terms of re-entering housing. One of the things that HUD is able to do through the Federal Housing Administration, FHA, is to make credit available on a very low down payment to first-time home buyers, and one of the things that we've been working very hard on is to make sure that that is available to communities who are currently excluded from the market, both because of credit history that dates back to 2008, as well as other discriminatory factors. You'll learn how to address making sure that you're not discriminating against people with disabilities. As I mentioned, 53% of complaints that HUD fields are from folks with disabilities. You will spend, I am sure, a lot of time on support animals. And I don't claim to be the expert on the difference between HUD's support animals rules and the ADA service animal rules, but I know it becomes a topic of a lot of conversation. Issue of discrimination against women, which one would hope we had gotten away from, but as I said, we're finding a lot of systemic discrimination against people based on pregnancy, making assumptions not based on the person or what their intent is, but based on their sex and their condition. And I'm pleased to say that HUD has just issued a rule that expands, as it was allowed to do in 2013, the Violence Against Women's Act. It may sound a little horrifying, but a number of people get evicted for disturbances in the building because they were the victim of domestic violence. That is not allowed now, and that should not be allowed. If you are the victim of domestic violence, that should not be a ground to evict you. Hear about dealing with communities with limited English proficiency, making sure that you're not discriminating on the basis of national origin. I heard a mention of criminal history. As I said at the start, one of the things I found working with homelessness is our criminal justice system disproportionately involves people of color. Not because, and you look just at drug offenses, there are as much drugs, and actually more statistically, in the white community as there is in the African American community, but the arrests happen in the African American community. You start using a 10-year-old nonviolent drug arrest as a reason to exclude somebody, you're essentially excluding people on the basis of race. And it doesn't have anything to do with whether or not they're really going to be a good tenant, that 10-year-old conviction. That's things to think about if you really want to give everybody a fair opportunity. And then, as I said, affirmatively furthering fair action. The new rule is set to roll out. Hopefully it makes it a lot easier for small communities. It prepares a lot of the information in advance for the small communities. But to say, how do you do your planning around making sure that everybody has an opportunity? Not just how do you make sure that there are new opportunities, but how do you preserve old opportunities? How do you make sure that a community doesn't get gentrified out and all of a sudden become a uniform community because opportunities disappeared? And that's something we really have to work together on. And finally, I need to mention, because it's really important to folks who are property managers, Section 3. HUD very strongly encourages, and there are things in the regs, people who receive HUD money to employ very low-income people, particularly from the neighborhood in which the money is being spent now under the new rule, but very low-income people and companies that are owned by very low-income people. The way folks who qualify learn is often through you, the property managers, through making sure there's something posted in the building that talks about where you can go to register on what's known as the Section 3 registry, how you can make sure that contractors know that you're there and are looking for work and qualify for Section 3 work. So you're going to have a whole piece tomorrow on Section 3. So I leave you with really a call to action. It is great that you're here because what it says is that you really want to make sure that the vision that we all have for everybody in our community is met. That we figure out a way to make sure that not only on a conscious level do we say that discrimination is bad, but that we figure out a way that we evaluate someone when they come to us really on the basis of who they are and what their qualities are, and not what our assumptions are based upon a situation they find themselves in, or a condition, or a national origin for themselves. I think that it's really important that you come to the education part of this. I hope that you never encounter the enforcement part of this. And I just want to say thank you very much for participating in these 2 days. Thank you. Oh, and I suppose I do have time for questions. If there are questions, which I may put off to somebody else. Yes? What about the deaf community? The deaf community, it certainly is a disability. It's a community in which you should not be discriminating against. I will say it is one of the interesting, so that saying, for example, you are deaf, I'm not going to rent to you because I don't feel that I've got a doorbell that's got a flashing light. Well, to make a unit accessible, it would be good to install a doorbell with an accessible light, but you also have to let somebody make their own choice as to where they want to live. One of the problems with discrimination against people with disabilities is choosing for them rather than letting them choose for themselves. Is there a particular, one issue that has come up in the deaf community is there have been a couple of buildings, one in particular in Arizona, that was built specifically to serve the deaf community with a number of living assistance items. And initially HUD said you cannot market specifically to the deaf community because that would be discriminating against people who aren't deaf. Fortunately, HUD figured out the way around it. You can create a supportive community if it is truly giving people an option. But did you have a sub-question within the deaf community? The comment is that right, and the comment was that the deaf community is often overlooked, and we aren't taking care of them the way we should. And I would agree, and I'm going to turn to in a second. But yeah, in many ways, the barriers, it is something that is easy to overlook because it's not immediately apparent, but can be very isolating if we do not make accommodations available. But
yeah, and recently HUD just did a study through the Urban Institute, both for persons who use wheelchairs and persons who are hearing impaired or deaf, and found some pretty startling, as you may already know, information about, in our case with the wheelchair study, over 90% of housing was inaccessible or modifications were denied. And in the hearing impaired study, which should come out within the next year, it was paid for by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. People are hung up on, have no opportunity even to apply because they don't wait to communicate with the person. So it's pretty startling, and I agree that that's something we need to be more, that's why we attend training. The ADA, Northwest ADA, and Disability Rights Idaho had a very good training that they did. So I encourage you to attend those as well.
And it's one of the questions to ask yourself. If you have a deaf tenant, do you actually have a way for them to contact you? Do you have a TTY line? What have you done to make sure that they have the same ability to deal with you as a property manager as a person who is not deaf does? Yes?
Sorry. My nephew is deaf and lives with me. So we sign, and I don't know if people are aware, you actually, the majority of the deaf community now, thanks to the internet, you no longer have to have TTY. There's a video phone. So the person that is deaf uses the video phone, they sign to the translator, and the translator speaks to you, and it's very easy to have it's a conversation like you and I can have right now. Just whatever you're going to say, you just say it to the translator, and they sign. And it's incredibly helpful because my ASL is not that great, so I have misinterpreted things that have been said. So he has called me through the video line. That's not what I said. So I don't know anybody if anybody is aware, but I'm just kind of letting you know that
what would they Google to find the link to that?
I'm sorry?
What would they Google to find the link to that service? Is there a name for it? How would somebody find that?
You know what? I don't know. I didn't ask. I'm sorry. But it is I'm sure, you know, when you there's if you do a Google search just for deaf community, or I would do video phone deaf community, I know that there's a couple services, but that's what they do, and then they're assigned. So like my nephew, I have a phone number for him, and I just call it, just like anything else. Great, thank you. And maybe if you find out overnight which one you use, we can have it at the front desk for people tomorrow who are interested.
We'll find that information out and actually put it on the Idaho Fair Housing Forum's website as a link.
It's called
Relay service.
Yeah, you can do video relay with the great equipment, or they can even, and they use it a lot when they call in, like customer service, different agencies, things like that, and the relay person verbatim legally has to say every single word of the actual.
It's called the Video Relay System or service, and we'll get the link and put it on our website.
Anything else? Great point. Thank you. All righty. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay.